Hi, everybody, and welcome to Middle Eastern Islamic History, episode 41. Today, we're going to be talking about the Balkan Wars and Albanian independence, which, while not strictly in the Middle East, definitely has a lot of impacts on the Ottoman Empire and its Middle Eastern holdings, which is why it's incredibly important. And yes, you heard that number right, 41. We have 40 other episodes in this series, and we will move on to the rules. The rules are that this is not an academic presentation. I am not accredited in history, philosophy, religion, or any of the topics that we're going to be discussing. This is also going to be a presentation given from a secular lens. We're going to be talking about a lot of difficult subjects tonight, right? So let's be respectful about that. But at the same time, I'm going to try and do it from a neutral perspective that will fault every side for where they have committed atrocities. That said, I love interactivity. Questions, comments, clarifications, please put them in the chat. I do look at the chat and will respond in real time. What I like to say is these presentations are a 101 and a 201, meaning that if you don't know anything, I'll catch you up. And if you already knew something, I'll probably tell you something you didn't know. I also will have a 2-hour hard stop, which is the same as every other previous presentation. And that means that if we get to the end of 2 hours and I haven't covered all my slides, that's okay. Those slides will simply go to next week, and we will finish up whatever discussion we're having, but no new material will be presented. So you know that after 2 hours, we're over. And when I put the dates underneath somebody, that is their years of service, that is not their lifespan, in whatever role that they happen to have, it be it general, president, prime minister, that sort of thing. And like the other 40 episodes in this series and numerous other series, this episode will be recorded and you can watch it later in order to see it in the full weight of everything that came before it. In fact, that may well be useful since this is sort of a direct continuation of episode 28, which, unless you have my kind of memory, you probably don't remember everything that happened in episode 28. So let me sort of bring you up to speed. Now, this presentation, the presentation preceding it, and the presentation next week are 3 parts of sort of the same history moving forward. And so last week we covered what was going on in Constantinople and Anatolia with Abdul Hamid's reign. This will also happen during Abdul Hamid's reign, but he's going to be noticeably absent because of how minimally effective he was in the Balkan region, which we're going to cover today. And next week, we're going to talk about the Persian revolutions, which overthrew the authoritarian style, the autocratic style of the Qajar rulership and replaced it with a constitutional monarchy, which led all the way up to the Pahlavi dynasty being inaugurated in 1925. So we are going to cover that next week, and you're going to see a lot of the changes sort of overflow. And there are things that go from side to side. I like using the Lord of the Rings as an example. You have these 3 parallel quests. There is some overlap between them, and you have to understand them all together in order to get the full picture. But each one, if you examine it on its own, has a lot of complexity. And so I've broken it apart so that we're not quite shifting backwards and forwards between all these different perspectives. So if we remember from episode 28, we talked about how the Balkans was a region with numerous different ethnic groups wedged together, and also that those ethnic groups do not exist in simple singular regions where you can just carve it out easily. For example, if you look at that southern area, you can see those red dots. Those are Turks scattered throughout the Bulgaro-Slavic population. You see those green areas, which are Greek people, and you see that there's still mixture there. You have Albanians, which are the yellow, but you also have in them that sort of dark bluish gray color, which are Aromanians and Vlach, which are Romance language speakers, but are not related to, they're distantly related to the populations in Romania and some of the Romance speakers along the coast of Croatia. So you've got these very mixed regions that are sort of pulling apart. And the question is, how is that going to be changing? And we're going to see some of that in this presentation today. We also discussed last time in episode 28 about how there was the development of independent states in the Balkans as the Ottoman Empire came into retreat. And in particular, we talked about the relationship between the Karađorđe, and you can see Karađorđe at the top, who took a more aggressive pro-Serbian position within Serbia, and his successor, Miloš Obrenović, who you can see there from the Obrenović family. And those two families, the Karađorđević, those who are the sons of Karađorđe, and the Obrenovićes, those who are the sons of Miloš Obrenović, will continue to fight over the rule of Serbia, with Obrenović rulers tending to be more conciliatory to neighboring states, more willing to enter into alliances, and the Karađorđes being more nationalistic and more, let's say, pro-Serbian in that sort of sense. We also talked about that in the beginning of the 19th century, we had the Filiki Eteria, which was a Greek organization based in what is today Odessa, right? That area was under Russian control at that period, and therefore it was outside the Ottoman Empire's reach, which allowed it to bring together all of the Orthodox rebellions throughout the Ottoman Empire. The Serbians are Orthodox, the Bulgarians are Orthodox, the Greeks are Orthodox. Of course, they come from different churches, but they're all within the Orthodox world. And so they were all represented by Filiki Eteria, and that led to them being able to become more and more independent and coordinate their developments together. During this period, we also saw the development of Serbian nationality, Serbian identity, and these things came out as a result of the writings of Dositej Obradović, who was responsible for really formalizing the Serbian language, and Vuk Karadžić, who was very famous for putting together descriptions of what Serbian cultural life was, going to the peasantry and creating sort of a narrative of Serbian identity in terms of what Serbs were doing and how Serbs understood themselves. And so because of this, you have similar uprisings going on. This is, for example, the Wallachian uprising, which was in what is today Romania, the southern part of Romania. We talked also about how the Greeks became independent, and that the Greek independence was sort of bifurcated on two sides. The first side are the Klefts and the Amatoloi, who you can see here. Those are mountain living Greeks, relatively uneducated bandits, and they were able to establish, through strength of arms, control over their own region. Even at the height of the Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman government was not able to take control of the most mountainous parts of Greece, and you can see how mountainous Greece is on the left-hand side there. Because the Klefts and Amartoloi were able to control those regions and would pass into and out of alliances with the Ottomans. And then you had the other side of the Greek world, which was brought about by this cultural awakening. And this was led especially by the Fanariotes, the Greeks based in the Fener district of Istanbul, as well as Greeks who were living in Europe. A perfect example of the latter is Adamantios Korais. And you can see Adamantios Korais. He develops the language of Katharevusa, which is somewhere between high-level Greek and the Greek that people were speaking in the streets, to create a very erudite language, but at the same time, a language that Greek people could understand, and creating that nexus that would allow Greek culture to develop, right? So you have this sort of tense relationship that develops between the Klefts and Amatoloi, who are the physical grunts, if you want to think of it this way, who really form the Greek state, and those like Adamantios Korais and Rigas Feraios, who are these Greek leaders who are leading the mental spirit and concept of what it means to be a Greek person, as well as really running the levers of the state from a organizational standpoint. And so add to this the Greek religious establishment, which you can see, this is Bishop Germanos of Old Patras, and he is blessing the flag of the Greek soldiers before they fight in the revolution that would eventually get Greek their independence. And one of the things that we notice starting with the Greek Revolution is that foreign countries get themselves involved, and they get involved in two ways. The first one is, you can see here in the center, Lord Byron, who was a British poet and romantic, came to Greece expecting to find the land of Plato and Aristotle. He found something slightly different, but he still embraced the Greek cause, and through his poetry was able to champion support and love of Greeks in the West. And that love of Greeks, not exclusively from Lord Byron, but from a number of different Westerners, especially in Britain and France, led to the creation of Philhellenic societies, lovers of Greeks, right? Philhellenes, right? Lovers of Greek societies who financially contributed and also ideologically contributed to the Greek struggle against the Ottomans. We also see military intervention, for example, in the Battle of Navarino, where British and Russian ships basically blockade the port and prevent Ottomans from actually attacking the Greek rebels. And because of this international intervention, the Greeks are able to achieve independence. And we're going to see this as a recurring theme, that the countries of the rest of Europe believe that they have a role in solving the Balkan crises. And we can discuss later whether we think that's advantageous or not. So Greece forms, and we have other kinds of rebellions in the Ottoman Empire as well. One of the interesting rebellions that I spent some time on was the rebellion of Hussein Gradashevich, we can see here. And this was a rebellion not of a Christian minority seeking its own self-government, like we saw in Serbia and Greece just now, but this was a case of an Ottoman old guard losing its power due to the modernization reforms of Sultan Mahmud II. And accordingly, as power was diverted away from the local governors and towards Istanbul, we had a revolt from Hussein Gradashevich and a number of the other local governors who wanted to retain their authority and wanted to continue ruling as they had done. Today, right, Gradashevich is seen as a Bosniak nationalist, a nationalist for the Serbo-Croatian speakers who are of Muslim religious heritage. But ironically, in his own time, he would not have been seen as that at all. He was simply a Muslim defending his historic rights to power within the Ottoman structure. And one of the things that develops throughout Europe in 1848 is this rise of liberalism, and it affects the way that Europeans begin to see the Balkan region. Now, one of the interesting things you can notice from this map is that the Balkan region, by and large, is unaffected by the revolutions of 1848 directly. But because it happened in France, because it happened in Germany and in Vienna and Munich, Rome, the major centers of Europe, with the exception of London and Moscow, London and St. Petersburg at this time, because it happened in these major states, that's going to change their outlook on the Balkan region. And they're going to become more involved because they see the devolution of power to the local people as being increasingly important because it meets their own justification for the validities of their own countries. We then sort of get into the reign of Abdul Hamid. And we see that at the beginning, he had the Ottoman Parliament, and we discussed that at length. But the Ottoman Parliament, despite being very ethnically mixed, was disbanded within 2 or 3 years. And that was a direct result of the Great Eastern Crisis. And we mentioned this to a certain degree. What had effectively happened is that a number of different states came together and fought against the Ottoman Empire. And I wanted to take a second to delve a little bit into one of these, and that's Montenegro. If you look at the map that I've got here, you can see that Montenegro started in the city of Cetinje, which is near the Black Mountain, right? That's where the name Montenegro comes from. It's the Italian for Black Mountain. So it's very close to the Black Mountain, and it began to expand outwards, first a little bit more inland, and then beginning to move its way closer and closer to Serbia. Now, the Montenegrins were a very interesting case in that even though they were seeking independence in 1858, so between the time a little bit after the Greeks had sought independence, they were actually able to repel the Ottoman armies on their own in the Battle of Grahovac. And the Battle of Grahovac was very unique in that because the Montenegrins were fighting in the mountain, it was very hard for the Ottomans to use their superior numbers, and that led to a Montenegrin victory led by Danilo I Petrovich Njegoš, who was the first knyaz or prince of a new independent Montenegro. And Montenegro and Serbia then began to have this new relationship because Serbia had become independent during this time, and now Montenegro was independent, but the two of them were split by a small wedge of the Ottoman Empire. You can see there in the map in the lower left-hand side, it's labeled as Bosnia because that was part of the Ottoman province of Bosnia. But both Serbia and Montenegro believe that that territory should belong to them. And so you begin to see animosity, but also support between the two sides. Support because they're both fighting the Ottomans, and difficulty because both of them want this territory in order to expand into. Eventually, it would be divided between them. But for the moment, that would cause a lot of friction. But if we go to the Great Eastern Crisis, we can see Nicola I, who is the successor to Danilo. Danilo dies very soon after the Battle of Grahovac. And he, along with a number of other Balkan groups, such as the Bulgarians and the Serbs who are living in Bosnia, and the Greeks as well, begin a number of revolts. And these lead to severe repressions from the Ottoman side. You can see, for example, the Batak massacre, and we talked about this in episode 28. This was a massacre of the Bulgarians who had revolted, and that massacre, because of how horrendous it was, got press in the West, and it got press in the Russian Empire, and compelled the great powers, at least in their view, to act. I have a question of, can I speak about the Serbian and Montenegrin religious points of view? Absolutely. Both of these groups are part of the Serbian Orthodox Church, which is a recognized division of the Orthodox Church. We're going to talk a little bit about breakaway churches, exarchates, and things like that soon. But the Serbian Church was a recognized church. That said, one of the interesting things about Prince Danilo Petrovich Njegoš is that he was actually not originally a prince. He was originally a bishop, and Montenegro had been designated as a bishopric for the Serbian Orthodox Church historically. What Danilo did in rejecting the cloth and becoming a knyaz or a prince meant that he was now a secular ruler, and this created an interesting tension between the Serbs, who were fighting alongside their church leaders, and the situation in Montenegro, where effectively the church was a supporter of the regime, but wasn't part of the independent struggle because all the royalty had simply left the church in terms of their day-to-day functioning. Aaron, is there something you'd like to add to that?
Okay. Oh, great. Yeah, no, I mean, it's great to, I think, if we can, as we go through this, understand where some of these, almost like the original sin happens between all of the fragmented relationships in the region, which then by the early 20th century, obviously, is attempted to be reconstructed or reconstituted into, Yugoslavia. And then, and what that manifestation, what the difference in the manifestations are, right? Some are religious, some are nationalist, some are national religious, some are, you can almost argue, regionally tribalist. I mean, so there's, so the more that we can maybe enrich that conversation, I think it will help people most of which have a sense of this because of what happened in the 90s in the Yugoslavia war and in the war of Yugoslavia, that just didn't come out of left field, right? That's been permeating for, really since the independent movements in the 1800s. And I think it all feeds this, right? I mean, you had this very powerful set of independent movements for 100 years, which I don't think get a lot of substantial airtime, primarily because the airtime is covered by the British Empire expanding, or the Napoleonic era, or the creation of the German state, or et cetera. And so we don't really understand all these independent movements that
Right.
were flowing. Really, it's like a flow of independent movements.
Right. I think if you're looking for the original sin, I think the original sin was that the Ottoman Empire didn't know how to deal with the question of equality. And right, we
Yep.
talked about Ottomanism and the attempt to inculcate this, but there were conservative factors in both the majority and minority religious communities that were opposed to this. And because of this new change and new desire to have a system that would treat people as equals on the one hand, and a desire to retain the entrenched historical system that had worked for 400 years or so, at least in the eyes of the governing officials, both from majority and minority religious groups. You have this situation that is irreconcilable on its face. You can't have two governments in the same territory. And then furthermore, the solution that a lot of the minorities come to is that, okay, we're going to leave this system altogether, and we want to take all of our people with us. And depending on whether it's religious iconography, whether it's nationalistic iconography, there are differences, and we're going to discuss that. But the inexorable end is that bringing all of our people with us in a multinational, multi-ethnic empire where people are living in diverse communities necessarily means that somebody is going to lose territory, and somebody is going to have to live in the land of the other. Or you solve it a very different way, and we're going to see some of the other solution to that problem, which increasingly becomes more and more negative. All right. So then we had a war with Russia from 1877 to 1878, where the Russians intervened to protect the interests of all those Balkan groups that were rebelling and being repressed by the Ottoman Empire in those rebellions. And unlike the Crimean War, where the British and the French were strong allies of the Ottoman Empire, intervened on the Ottoman Empire's behalf and won the war for the Ottoman Empire, that did not happen here. The Ottomans were facing the British, the Ottomans were facing the Russians, and they simply could not win, no matter how well they fought. And it meant that the Russians would prevail. Now, one of the things we addressed is that there were numerous massacres that occurred during this period on both sides. For example, you have the Bulgarian committed massacres of Tarnava, which targeted Muslims and Jews who were living in the Bulgarian city. You have the rebellions against the Bashibozuks, who were Muslim populations, who were sort of nominal raiders and irregulars that were operating in the Balkans. Some of them were Circassian, some of them were Albanian, some of them were Turkic, and of course their families as well were executed and hanged. So that's on the Christian side, persecuting Muslims. On the Muslim side, persecuting Christians. You can see the attacks on Armenians, especially in the eastern part of Anatolia, from Kurds and Circassians. And you have a number of massacres designed to repress the Bulgarian revolutions, like those at Stara Sakora. And the Western European public and the Central European public heard about the latter ones, not about the former ones. And so their view during this period was of these blameless Christians fighting for their independence against an oppressive Islamic regime. And there's certainly truth in that account, but it's not complete. And so we then operate to the point where we get this Treaty of San Stefano. And this is a treaty that the Russians impose upon the Ottoman Empire. And in that treaty, they create this large Bulgarian state, which would include all the territory of Bulgaria today, all the territory of the independent country of North Macedonia today, parts of what is now Greece, parts of what is now Turkey, parts of what is now Romania, and parts of what is now Serbia, and as well as parts of what is now Albania. So this Bulgarian state would, in theory, control all of the people who spoke any Bulgarian language. But that treaty was rolled back by the Congress of Berlin, in which the Germans did not want such a powerful Bulgaria. And the reason the Germans didn't want a powerful Bulgaria was that it was increasingly clear that Bulgaria would be a puppet state of the Russians, and that would give the Russians strong abilities to possibly control the Balkan region, possibly retake Constantinople. And the Germans didn't want the Russians to have that kind of power. And so they restructured it, splitting Bulgaria into a Bulgarian state and an Eastern Rumelian state, which was a vassal of the Ottoman Empire. The Bulgarians were also a tributary state of the Ottoman Empire, no longer an independent country on paper. And Serbia and Montenegro were given only small territories in compensation. The real winner in this treaty was the Ottoman Empire, and we discussed that a little bit last week. But now, from the Balkan perspective, this treaty was a disaster. The Congress of Berlin left nobody satisfied because the Serbians, Bulgarians, Montenegrins all believed that they were deserving of more territory than what they were allotted under this treaty. And, right, as we mentioned, this leads to a massive change within the Ottoman Empire called istibdad, or the consolidation of power. And Abdulhamid II decides to abrogate the constitution. The British try to remove Abdulhamid II from power through court intrigues with Ali Suavi in what's called the Chiraghan incident. But Abdulhamid basically manages to put that down and become an absolute ruler, as the sultans before him had been. But in so doing, he alienates the British, who are no longer interested in defending the Ottoman Empire. So I wanted to give a second to talk about Bosnia. And for that, I've enlisted the help of Mark. Mark is somebody who is much more interested in the goings-on of mainstream Europe. And so I think that this would be a really great place for him to intervene. So go ahead.
All right. Thanks very much, Richard. And thanks for the review. So this section, obviously, Bosnia under the Habsburgs. Bosnia, just to reiterate, is one of the countries in the Balkans. It's a nation state today, out of the Yugoslavian Civil War. And the Habsburgs are a imperial ruling family of Austria, then later Austria-Hungary, and they've ruled that empire for a few hundred years. They're basically not dissimilar to the Romanovs are to Russia, basically. And so one of the things I wanted to mention before, at the very beginning of this, is that there are a few themes that I'll be touching upon. One of which is that Bosnia has always been under the influence of bigger powers, and this one in this slide is kind of showing influence from Rome, the Vatican, and the Patriarch in Constantinople. It was in a middle zone. It didn't have its own. Well, we'll talk about its own religion later on. It was never terribly important for either side. They eventually kind of fought over it, and one of the things, it never really grew its own identity. It always been split by the ethnicities and the religious differences in between. Another theme is that in the 1860s, the Ottoman governor Sharif Topol Osman Pasha, who incidentally helped create the Sarajevo brewery, did attempt to create a Bosnian identity. There was obviously rise in nationalism, and his alternative was, hey, we're all Bosnians, let's all get along. And that didn't work. Later on, when the Habsburgs came in, They tried the same thing, and that didn't work. Later on, the Americans, with the Dayton Accords after the Yugoslavian Civil War, tried to build a Bosnian identity, and that didn't work. So it's like, it's not working, guys. And lastly, the ethnic strife is in Bosnia has led to a lot of bloodshed. And another thing that it is a bit unique with Bosnia, with the exception of Albania, is that Bosnia has a significant Muslim population. At first, they weren't coming in from Anatolia. They're really basically Slavs that converted. You have in countries like Bulgaria, Greece, or what have you, you have Muslim minorities. But in Bosnia, you had almost half the population in 1910 was Muslim. And then going to the next slide, if you please.
I just want to add something quickly. In a lot of the areas that we see otherwise in the Balkans, they did have a significant Muslim population before the events that we're going to talk about this week. Since Bosnia was spared from those, Bosnia retained a lot of its Muslim population while these other regions didn't.
Yeah, they ended up back in Anatolia as refugees. So here, this is one religion that was in Bosnia. The Bogolans, it's a religion that is it's Christian. It's not dissimilar to the Albigensians in southern France in that they eschewed a church hierarchy. They didn't really have churches so much. There were priests, but you didn't have bishops and things like that. And just like the Albigensians, they were crushed. So there was a genesis of a bit of a Bosnian religion, but by the early Middle Ages, that went by the wayside because of violence. And then next, very briefly about the Congress of Berlin, because Richard just mentioned it. But just to say that the Russians had won the war in 1878 against the Ottomans. They were in control a lot of the Balkans. Bismarck and the Germans didn't like that. Bismarck was all about balance of power, and he saw that there was an imbalance there with the Russian victory. And you see in this cartoon, it's basically he's running the puppets of the Russian, the Sultan, and the Tsar of Russia, and he was basically in control of this. And so what happened was, as an outcome of this, in that Bosnia stayed de jure part of the Ottoman Empire, but the Austrians were allowed to occupy it. So in the next slide, so even though the Habsburgs were given the right to occupy it, and the Ottomans didn't really get in the way of that, the locals did, particularly the Serbs and the Muslims. So there were a couple of battles, significant ones. The Austrian, it wasn't a cakewalk per se. The Austrians ended up with an army of 82,000 men and 13,000 horses. It took them 3 months to conquer the Bosnia, and they had 5,000 casualties out of 82,000, which is not insignificant for a modern army. And you might wonder, because with historical hindsight, why the Habsburg would have wanted to rule more Slavs. Why have more minorities in a nation state that already was full of minorities? But the Habsburgs, the Austrians, they just didn't think in those terms. That they didn't consider the rights, the political rights of the people of Bosnia. They were just going to be treated kind of like a colony. Some of the motivations the Austrians had was this prestige. The Austro-Hungarians had recently lost in the Battle of Königgrätz against the Prussians. They were a declining power like the Ottomans, and they were hungry for prestige and victories. So occupying Bosnia was prestigious. They did have a goal of trying to create a national conscience. They had a belief that they could control these nationalities. And obviously, there was less of a problem in 1878 than, say, 1918. But obviously, we know where that went. So the next slide on Habsburg rule. one of the things, there was a question with the dual empire, the Austrians and the Hungarians, they each had their own areas that they ruled over. Who was going to rule over Bosnia, the Hungarians or the Austrians? The Austrians won out on this. And one of the ways that that manifested is that it didn't become a part of Austria-Hungary for the time being, but they declared it as a crown region. So basically it was ruled by the crown, and the Bosnia was ruled specifically by the finance minister. So if you could think about it, as an analogy, it's like the Americans having their Hawaiian colony and it being ruled by the Treasury Secretary. It's kind of strange, but that was the way it needed to do it. And here on the upper left, there's the Paris exhibition. The reason that was important was this was one of the way the Austrians were trying to build a Bosnian identity, a Bosnian nationality. And the Paris exhibition was to do that, show, hey, that this is the Bosnian culture. There were also a lot of efforts to increase agriculture and education. One of the major things that the Austrians did right in the beginning was they wanted to divide the ethnicities from the control of the religions. So the first religion they went after was the Muslims, and Vienna came out with a rule that basically the Muslim clerics, the imams, are now functionaries of the state, and they have to take orders from Vienna. Next was the Serbian Orthodox. So the Austrians went to Constantinople and basically bribed the patriarch to have authority over the Bosnian Serbs. So I don't think that would fly today with the patriarch or Rome or anything like that. But that's how they did it. And then later on with the Catholics were less of a problem because both the Austrians were Catholic. I believe the Hungarians are also Catholic. They were less of a problem, and they already had Croats in the empire. But eventually they negotiated an agreement with the Vatican that Vienna would take control over the religious matters of the Catholics under the stipulation that the Austrians would not publish it. And then they published it, just to show the power that the Vatican had. They had two main governors, Benjamin von Kálai and Stefan Burian, both Hungarians, but they had different approaches. One of the major things that the Austrians came in, one thing they ignored the power differential between landlords and the farmers. That was a major element of strife. They pretty much ignored it. But what they did do, and they did a good job of, was building the infrastructure. They built roads, railroads, bridges, tunnels. They increased farming production. They created something like 200 high schools. With this idea, they thought they would build this Bosnian identity by building up this infrastructure. That didn't particularly work very well. It's really a story of nationalities with the ethnic strife. When Benjamin von Kálai, he had basically the first 20 years of the Austrian rule, and Burian the last 10 years roughly. And I think that's all I had. I was going to mention Konrad von Hötzendorf. He'll come back a little bit later in the crisis with the annexation. But remember, the Austrians didn't have the legal rule over Bosnia, just de facto. So in 1908, the Austrians saw an opportunity. Two main things, there are two main rivals in the Balkans, the Ottoman Empire and the Russians were both distracted. In the Ottoman Empire, you had the Young Turks, who not only were kind of distracted, the body politic of the Ottoman Empire was also more democratic, And the fear that Austria had was that they would take back control of Bosnia, but, with a Muslim relative majority. And then with Russia, they were in the middle of the 1905 revolution and the chaos created by their defeat in the Russo-Japanese War. So they saw this opportunity and they annexed it. And people were most everyone was angered by this. The Germans didn't like it particularly, but the Austrians, I'm sorry, the Russians and the Ottomans and some of the other nations saw this as a tipping of the balance of power towards the Austrians and upsetting the balance that had been reestablished by the Congress of Berlin. But eventually it died out after about 3 months. And one of the things that the Austrians, during this crisis, they were able to not extract so much, but they Hötzendorf, as a note about Hötzendorf, Field Marshal, he was as much of a warmonger as he was a horrible general. He ended up being in command of the Austrian army or Austro-Hungarian army in World War I. And he was absolutely, totally incompetent. And up to World War I, whenever there was a crisis, his solution to that crisis was war with Serbia. And it was always war with Serbia. What the Austrian Hungarians did, what they didn't realize is that they were stepping into such a landmine with this. And so on the next slide, just as the last one, some of the consequences of this action of the occupation, then later annexation of Bosnia. You have in the upper central part some pictures of World War I. You have Franz Josef, the emperor, who came to power, and that's an important date that Richard was mentioning, 1848. I believe he was born in 1830, so he was 18 years old when he became emperor at the time of all these revolutions, very scary revolutions for people of his class. So that was a formative set of events for him, and he ended up being quite the conservative, not particularly interested in democracy or congresses or anything like this. The photo below is with the heir apparent, the crown prince, Franz Ferdinand, and his wife. I believe her name was Sophie. This is pictures of their last day in Sarajevo before the assassination by Princip that triggered World War I. Now, I don't want to be so deterministic to say the Austrian action in Bosnia that means then you get World War I by definition. You don't, but it is the set of events that ended up rolling forward. And basically the Austrians simply didn't, they underestimated the problems that they would be facing with the nationalities. They thought they could handle it, and then they could not. But as I'd like to finish with an anecdotal story of a friend of mine who is from Sarajevo. His father was a civil engineer in Sarajevo in the 80s. And in this time, they wanted to expand the natural gas network heating, for the city of Sarajevo. And they needed plans. Where are the existing pipelines? And the Yugoslavian government had built out some of the network in the 50s. And so they pull out the plans, and the pipes were never where they said were. They were never where the archive maps said they were. They would always be across the street or a few meters off. And when you're digging for these things, it really matters that you have these accurate. So they looked up the Austrian archives and the Austrian plans for the gas, and they were exactly where those maps said they were. So they did some things right.
Mark. Yeah, so just a couple small notes. You mentioned the Young Turk Revolution of 1908, which was busying the Ottoman Empire during the Bosnian crisis of 1908.
Mm-hmm.
For those who are more interested in that, you can go to the presentation last week where we covered the Young Turk Revolution. In the comments, there was a mention of the Great Serb Migration. And if you're interested in sort of a deep dive on the Great Serb Migration, we discussed that in episode 26 and episode 27 because of its relationship to the Russo-Turkish War and to the reigns of Murad III and Mehmet III, I believe, of the Ottoman Empire. So thinking about Bosnia as sort of separate because it's under that Austro-Hungarian aegis, we then go back to the areas that were under the Ottoman Empire. And so in 1878, at the same time that you have the Treaty of San Stefano and the Congress of Berlin, and so you have a lot of discussion about how and in what ways the Balkans is going to be divided, we start having the first moments of Albanian organization. Now, it would be a little strong to say that this is Albanian nationalism at this point, because the Albanian organization here under the League of Prizren, and it's called the League of Prizren because that's the name of the city. It's in modern Kosovo today, where those delegates met. And the Albanian delegates who met there were not trying to create an independent state. What they were trying to do was coordinate between four different governorates or vilayet. There's the Kosovo vilayet, the Shkodra vilayet, based on the city of Shkodër in modern Albania, the Monastir vilayet, based on the city of Monastir in modern day North Macedonia, and the Yanina vilayet, based on the city of Yanina, which is in modern Greece. And these areas had historically been ruled by Albanian governors. And Albanians had been a disproportionately large section of the Ottoman Empire's intelligentsia, their governors, and their parliamentarians in the 1876 parliament. And in many ways, this resembles the revolt by Hussein Gradaščević in Bosnia in 1831, where you have an established power base, and they're worried about the loss of power that's going to accrue as a result of increasing reforms and weakening of the power of the Ottoman Sultan to protect those territories. The Ottomans, however, saw this as an attempt to weaken Ottoman power in the region and centralize power with the Albanians. And so Dervish Turgut Pasha brought his army in 1881. The primary purpose of that military actually was to stop Greece and Bulgaria, which were trying to absorb more territories after the Congress of Berlin. And the Greeks actually would get Thessaly. We'll talk about that in a bit. But while he was there, he defeated the League of Prizren in battle and disbanded that organization. Some of those Albanians survived and continued in their positions of previous power, with those powers devolved to a certain extent right back to Istanbul. But others were killed in that situation. Now, a few notes on the League of Prizren that sort of survive this moment. The first one is this idea of Greater Albania. And you can see a picture of Greater Albania on the right-hand side that a lot of Albanian nationalists today focus on. And many of them use the Prizren borders, which would include all four of those vilayets together in as the territory of the Albanian people, arguing that Albanians were either the majority or the ruling group in all of those territories, and therefore those territories should be part of a modern Albanian state. You also have this first real sense that Albanians might not be on board with the Ottoman power structure, despite the fact that almost the majority of the Prizren delegates were either Muslim or Bektashi, which Bektashi is a Shiite Sufi order, and we've discussed them in several of the previous lectures. The Bektashi were particularly prominent in Albania. Despite the fact that the majority were either Muslim or Bektashi, they would have direct issues with the Ottoman Empire, which was styling itself increasingly as a Muslim-led state. We also have Cyprus. So in the Congress of Berlin of 1878, the British had courted the Greeks, saying that they would help the Greeks get control of Thessaly Epirus and Crete, in exchange for British support. But in many ways, this was actually just a farce. And they traded on this with the Germans and the Ottomans in order for the British to get control of Cyprus, which was an Ottoman territory. And the British control of the region there's a question of, I'd been told by Serbian friends that the Albanian majority in Kosovo was due to immigration from Albania under Tito's rule. Therefore, their bid for independence was not fair to the Serbs. Is this true? It is true that if you look at the beginning of Yugoslavia in the 1920s and compare it to the end of Tito's reign in the 1980s, the percentage of Albanians in the region goes from minority to majority. That is true. And it's true because of immigration encouraged by Tito. But that starts the clock at 1920. That doesn't start the clock earlier. If you start the clock in 1878, the question is much more nebulous. And there were significant Albanian populations in Kosovo that were extirpated during the Balkan Wars. And we're going to talk about those. So it may well have been the case that Albanians were reconstituting the majority that they already had. So it's not entirely fair which way that question should be answered. Now, back in terms of Cyprus, so the British managed, as I said, in Berlin, to use the Greeks in order to negotiate their own position, which was that they wanted control of Cyprus. And they wanted control of Cyprus in order to have a better position to guard the Suez Canal. They sold it also to the Ottomans in that Cyprus was an ideal position to help protect the Dardanelles, which was key to the control of Constantinople. And you can see for obvious reasons why that would be important to the Ottoman Empire. And so the British built a number of ports in Cyprus. Now, the map that you see there is a map of Cyprus ethnically divided in 1960. There's really no reason to believe that the ethnic divisions in Cyprus were any different in 1878, with those yellowish tan areas being representative of Greek majority regions, and those purple areas being representative of Turkish majority regions. The red regions are the two British military bases of Akrotiri and Dhekelia. And Akrotiri and Dhekelia are both creations of the 20th century. So you can sort of wipe them off your map in terms of what would have existed in 1878. In fact, the main British port was one that they had expanded significantly from its earlier construction, which is the port of Famagusta, now in Turkish controlled northern Cyprus as Famagusta. So the British control of Cyprus was a very strange situation. And the way it was strange is that it was basically a British lease over the territory with no termination date. And this is how the Ottoman Empire was able to sell it to the Ottoman population. He hadn't ceded Cyprus to the British government. He had simply leased it to them. And the way that this lease was regulated was through what was called the Cyprus tribute. The British would, based on the value of the island, provide an annual sum to the government of the Ottoman Empire. At least that was the theory of how it was supposed to operate. In reality, what ended up happening is the British would tax the Cypriot population and then would use those taxes to, in theory, pay the Ottoman Empire. But they never actually did that. The Ottoman Empire had numerous war debts and construction debts in the Imperial Ottoman Bank that had been sent out to British lenders. And so the money that was collected from the Cyprus tribute was used directly to pay off the debts that the Ottomans owed the British. The British felt that this was the best allocation of the money from the Ottoman side. But from the position of the Cypriots, this seemed very, very difficult to swallow. And the reason it was that way was that a lot of the population of Cyprus, which was Greek, saw their tax dollars being going to pay the war debt of the Ottoman Empire, the country that they were happy no longer had control over their lives. And so this created a lot of tension between the Cypriot population, especially the Greek Cypriot population, and the British for effectively using their money to pay off Ottoman war debt. And so it actually took an act of parliament in the United Kingdom to set what the Cyprus tribute would be, lower significantly the taxes on Cyprus, and have a £50,000 annual compensation from the British Isles to supplement the lower taxes from the island of Cyprus to fulfill the needs of the Ottoman Empire in order to lessen the burden on the Cypriots. Now, one of the things that's really important to notice is that Cyprus remains under British control from 1875 until after World War II. And the reason that this is important is that a lot of the demographic alterations and difficulties that we're going to talk about in this discussion really don't present a problem in Cyprus until after World War II because of the British control of the island. In many ways, it's very similar to what we talked about with Bosnia, where the Austrian control of the region effectively prevented the internecine squabbles in the region until Bosnia got true independence. And that happened in the 1990s. So the thing that established the Cyprus tribute was the Convention of Constantinople. But the Convention of Constantinople recognized a number of other things as well. So, in particular, the territory that Greece held in 1878 was not the territory that the Greeks wanted to hold, and they wanted to expand further northward. In 1881, they expanded to the region of Thessaly, and that expansion sort of became grandfathered in with this Convention of Constantinople. And so Greece was able to acquire more territory against the Treaty of Berlin. The Greeks being able to do this showed how ineffective the Germans and others were going to be in sort of enforcing the Treaty of Berlin. And so we'll see more and more infractions of the Congress of Berlin as we go along. Another one that's not on the map here is that two of the small regions that were granted to Montenegro in 1878 had significant Albanian populations, and those Albanian populations resisted integration into Montenegro. So the Congress of Berlin authorized, and the Ottoman Empire agreed that in 1881 they would give up the city of Ulcin, which is today part of Montenegro, to Montenegro from the Ottoman Empire. It had previously not been accorded under the Congress of Berlin. And so you see these small territories that are being exchanged. And this, you increasingly see the spirit of this reflected in this megali idea, this idea that Greece should expand to all the territories of Greek-speaking people. And this, of course, created a strong negative reaction from the Turkish population there. Finally, you have military confrontations all along the border between Thessaly and Ottoman-controlled Epirus and Macedonia, and those situations only become further inflamed due to conflicts between local forces in the area. At the same time, a little bit later, we have what is called the Bulgarian crisis. If we remember, Bulgaria had been split into the northern part, which was a tributary state of the Ottoman Empire, and the southern part of Eastern Rumelia, which was a vassal state of the Ottoman Empire, still within Ottoman control. In 1885, the Knyaz, or prince of Bulgaria, invaded Eastern Rumelia and hoisted the Bulgarian flag. You can see a rendition of it in the upper right-hand side. And Eastern Rumelia was united with Bulgaria. Now, Eastern Rumelia in particular had a large Turkish population. We're talking about something like 30 to 40% of the population of Eastern Rumelia was Turkish or Pomak. Pomak being Slavic Bulgarian Muslims, Turkish being Turkish speakers. And these populations, by and large, had significant percentages of them forced out of Eastern Rumelia and into the regions of Thrace, where they served, where they tried to put their lives back together. At the same moment, the Russians refused, under Tsar Alexander III, to recognize the integration of Eastern Rumelia into Bulgaria, and this was started and this was the result of Bulgaria's increasing independence from Russia. So we need to backtrack a little bit, and we have the Bulgarian minister Stefan Stambulov. You can see him in the center. Stefan Stambulov had an idea of Bulgarian identity and Bulgarian independence first. So in contrast to what the Russians had intended with Bulgaria to create their own puppet state in the Balkans in order to expand their power and possibly move towards Constantinople, Stambulov wanted to create a modern Bulgarian state. And to that end, he sought to improve the economic and military situation and diplomatic situation of the Bulgarian princedom. He did this through sending diplomats to the other Balkan states, bringing over military advisors from Western countries, changing a number of the laws to improve the economy and increase trade. At each step, he was increasing Bulgaria's independence and was supported by Knyaz Alexander. A lot of people are named Alexander, unfortunately. Knyaz Alexander of Bulgaria in doing so. And this alienated the Russians because the Russians felt that they had a right, they had guaranteed the Bulgarian independence in the war of 1877 to 1878. And so they felt that Bulgaria owed them the right to control the area. In fact, as a result of this, in 1886, the Russians sent two generals straight from St. Petersburg to Bosnia in order to take control of Stambulov's military. At the same time, Russophilic actors removed Alexander I from power. He was still alive. They removed him from power and tried to put a Russian-led administration that would get rid of Stambulov and his acolytes. That said, because Stambulov had built the military, a number of military officers utterly refused to accept this new transition. One of them was Sava Mutkurov, and you can see him below. So Stambulov and Mutkurov worked together with a number of other military generals to not only force the Russian generals out of Bulgarian territory, but to create a counter-revolution in order to reinstate a Bulgarian monarch that they would find acceptable. And the person that they chose was Ferdinand I, who was related to the Austrian Habsburgs, and he became the knyaz of Bulgaria, and he would remain its ruler until 1918. His title changed to Tsar in 1908. We'll discuss that a little bit. But he managed to take power, and he agreed with Stambulov in creating a more independent Bulgaria, less tied to Russia. And as we see through the various decades, the relationships between Bulgaria and Russia continue to get worse and worse as Russia tries to assert more power over Bulgaria, and Bulgaria wishes to assert its own power as an independent state in the Balkans. One thing that I did not mention was that Serbia believed that a number of territories that Bulgaria controlled should actually belong to Serbia. And so there was actually a war between the Serbs and the Bulgarians in 1885, especially because the Serbs were afraid that with the conquest of Rumelia, Bulgaria would be unstoppable in its expansion towards Macedonia. So we have this sort of strange situation where not only were the Balkan states not necessarily aligned with Russia, Serbia still was, but of course Bulgaria, as we pointed out, wasn't, and Greece its relationship with Russia was tenuous at best. So not only are the Balkan states not aligned with Russia anymore, they're increasingly not aligned with each other. And so the Greeks saw the weakness here, and in 1891, their prime minister proposed an alliance between the three Christian states, Greece, Serbia, and Bulgaria. Montenegro was, of course, invited, but Montenegro was substantially weaker than the three, and so there wasn't really much for them to do. Now, from the perspective of Serbia and Bulgaria, there was really no point in an alliance with Greece, and there were a few reasons for that. The first one is that the regions that Greece wanted to acquire from the Ottoman Empire, like Thessaly, like Epirus, like Crete, were not areas that the Serbs or the Bulgarians really had designs on. There was one region, however, that they all shared interest in, and that was Macedonia. And so because they all shared an interest in conquering Macedonia, they all didn't want the other ones to have it. And so there was no grounds for an alliance there, simply because they wouldn't agree on what to do with it. There's a question, at this time, was there less of a distinction between Bulgarians and Serbs than there is today? No, I would say that at this point, because of the Bulgarian exarchate, Bulgarians and Serbs were distinct groups, and they recognized each other that way. Now, we mentioned that when we were talking about the Ottoman Empire, this is the time that the Ottomans were cultivating an alliance with Germany, and that alliance came to devote to military matters. And as you can see in the upper right-hand side, you had a number of German advisors who came to the Ottoman Empire to advise them on how to restructure their military in the wake of the defeat in 1877-1878 against Russia. Now, to be entirely fair to the Ottoman Empire, the army that they had brought together that the Ottoman Empire had fielded in 1877 to 1878 was the most modern army the Ottomans had ever fielded. But that said, it was still significantly worse than those of the European states. So the von der Goltz really stayed in the Ottoman Empire for over 20 years, and he was responsible for this next encounter with the Greeks, and you can see him up there as well. And this is the situation with Crete. So in 1897, you have Crete being a part of the Ottoman Empire, and it's ruled from the city of Chania, at that time called Kania. And Chania had a number of Greeks who were increasingly dissatisfied with the fact that Crete was not part of a Greek-run state. So in 1897, you start having these rebels, and they retreat from Crete to a mountain overlooking the city called Akrotiri. And they are led by a charismatic young man. You can see an older picture of him in the upper left-hand side, a sort of a younger picture of him actually standing at the forefront. You can tell by the mustache, and that's Eleftherios Venizelos. Eleftherios Venizelos is probably the most important Greek politician in the history of modern Greece. In many ways, he could sort of be understood as the George Washington of modern Greece in terms of his history. And he was born on Crete, and he was leading a number of these rebels to retake the city of Chania. And this led to, and the reason why these rebels were rebelling was that a number of historic Greek protections had been eroded over the past decade. In particular, if we look at Governor Ahmed Javad Pasha, who was governor from 1890 to 1891, during his reign, he repealed a number of the advantages, which were, for example, that the ruler of the territory would be Greek, that Greek language was the effective language of the laws, that there was a very strong autonomy in Crete. These protections for Greek identity were overturned by Ahmed Javad Pasha. And so this gave a number of Cretans the desire to fight for independence. And so they rose up and launched an attack on Chania. At the same time, Greece itself declared war on the Ottoman Empire in order to help the Cretans fight off the Ottomans. And so the Greeks were able to, using their adept naval prowess, which they already possessed, prevent more Ottoman troops from getting to the island. But at the same time, the Ottomans were more secure on land. And Kolmar von der Goltz and a number of other German officers directed the Ottoman armies in numerous battles in the region of Thessaly in northern Greece to astonishing victories, the Ottomans defeating one after another the Greek military divisions. For example, you can see the Battle of Belestino there. At first, it looked like it was going to be a Greek victory, but then the Ottomans routed the Greek forces and forced them further south. Now, the great powers were afraid that the Ottoman Empire might undo Greek independence and therefore intervened to stop this conflict in 1897. But Turkey had been the clear winner of the encounter, and Crete would remain a part of the Ottoman Empire. That said, it would be ruled by an international coalition, while sovereignty would still rest with the Ottoman Empire. Just for context in terms of time, right, that Greco-Turkish War took place in 1897, and that was just 1 year after the end of the Hamidian massacres that we talked about last time, when the Armenian population in the east was targeted for violence by Abdul Hamid using his irregulars. And of course, Abdul Hamid was using irregulars in the east because his best troops were being trained by the Germans in the Balkans. So if we get back to Macedonia, right? We've talked about how Greece wanted to expand into Epirus, which was non-contested with the other Christian states, but the region of Macedonia absolutely was. And so we now come to this point called the Macedonian struggle, which takes place in the last decade of the 19th century and the first decade of the 20th century into the Balkan Wars, which will end in 1913. So there's something important to point out here, which is that there is no good ethnic map of Macedonia, but what maps we have show what a diverse region it is. You can see that there are Serbs, according to this ethnographic map, which was produced by a Serbian university, so you can see some of the bias in there. But you can see in the northern part of Macedonia, close to the city of Skopje, the population is mixed Albanian and Serb. If you get further south, you see that the population is Macedonian, that's that dark green, and Turkish and Greek, and the Greeks are in that orange color. So now the distinction between Macedonian and Bulgarian is one that the Serbs definitely believed in. It's not one that the Bulgarians believed in. So you could also see those dark green areas as being Bulgarian populations as well, right? The idea that a person is a distinct nationality is something that develops over time. And at this point, it's not entirely clear that there was a Macedonian nationality. There may well have been, but it's not clear. And so all three of these powers, Serbia, Bulgaria, and Greece, are now interested in that region of Macedonia, which is controlled, of course, by the Ottoman Empire because of the populations of Serbs, Macedonian Bulgarians, and Greeks who live in the region. So we also need to sort of understand what a Bulgarian is before we get into the question of really what a Macedonian is and how that sort of fits together. So originally, the Bulgarians were part of the Greek Orthodox Church, but in 1857, the Bulgarians felt that the Greek Orthodox Church didn't represent their political questions and their liturgical issues in the same way that it represented the Greek political aspirations and the Greek liturgical issues. There was no distinction in this case between church and state. They were really, the church was literally the center of where the state was. In fact, Stambulov, who we talked about earlier, maintained good relations with the Ottoman Empire, which got him a lot of consternation from the Russians, because Stambulov wanted to work with Bulgarian members of the Bulgarian church, the Bulgarian Exarchate. We're going to talk about what that means. But the Bulgarian Exarchate that were living in the Ottoman Empire. So in 1857, the Bulgarians wanted to break apart from the Greek Orthodox Church, but they didn't get permission to do so and create their own autocephalous, self-governing church. And because they were broken out of Orthodoxy, they were what were called an exarchate. So the Bulgarian exarchate, however, was recognized by the Ottoman Sultan at the time, and accordingly, you can see this is St. Stephen Church in Balat, Istanbul, which was recognized as the head of the Bulgarian exarchate. So, according to the Bulgarians, any person who was a member of the Bulgarian church, part of that Bulgarian exarchate church, was themselves a Bulgarian. And the Slavic populations in Macedonia, some of them were members of the Serbian Orthodox Church, and some of them were members of the Bulgarian Exarchate. So from the Bulgarian perspective, those people were Bulgarians. From the perspective of the Serbs, they might not be Bulgarians. They might be Macedonians, distinct from being Bulgarians. So you have this sort of debate, and this debate rages on today with the independent Republic of North Macedonia. What's interesting about the map on the right-hand side is that this is a dialect map that compares the different dialects in the Bulgarian-speaking world. That doesn't mean that everywhere that is shaded in here is an area which is majority Bulgarian-speaking. It just means that the Bulgarians who are in those regions fit within these dialectical strands. And you can see that those dialectical strands occupy the entirety of the territory of North Macedonia, which underlies the Bulgarian claim that North Macedonian Slavs are actually Bulgarians who just speak a different dialect on the continuum of Bulgarian language. That said, on the Macedonian side, which has been heavily influenced by the fact that Serbia conquered most of North Macedonia, the Macedonians claimed that they had their own language and their own identity. And we can see probably the first real development of that was led by Kista Misirkov, and he wrote Vardar magazine, which was published in Odessa. It doesn't have that many iterations, but Vardar magazine was written in the Macedonian dialect of Bulgarian. That's how the Bulgarians would classify it. And Kista Misirkov would classify it as the Macedonian language. In fact, his book, Za na Makedonike Rabote, or On Macedonian Matters, is actually written in Macedonian, and it is a grammatical discussion of what the Macedonian language has, the way it functions, and how Macedonia should be an independent country with its own identity. So even in this early period, in the early 20th century, the Macedonians already had, at least some of them, a conception of a Macedonian identity separate from a Bulgarian or Serbian identity. If you're interested in this Macedonian question, we also have a recording up on Omnicarta that goes through the entire Macedonian question from the period of Alexander the Great to the modern treaty stipulating the title of North Macedonia that was signed in 2018. So during this period, you now have this struggle for Macedonia. Who will have military control? The first group I want to point out are those that are Bulgarian or Macedonian Slavic aligned. So you have the VMRO, that's the Slavic acronym VMRO, which stands for Internal Macedonian Adrianople Revolutionary Organization. And you have the SMAC, which is the Supreme Macedonian Adrianople Committee. Now, there is a difference between these two organizations. The VMRO, as far as it could figure, was an internal organization made by Macedonians in Macedonia. That said, it was certainly not entirely independent of Bulgarians. And the origins of the VMRO, as is attested from numerous internal Bulgarian memos, was from Bulgarians who went into Macedonia and began to provide the ethnic and religious voice to the Slavic Macedonian population to identify themselves as part of the Slavic world and to rise up against the Ottoman Empire, numerous of them crossing over the border into Ottoman-controlled Macedonia in order to create this. And this resulted in what were called the Chetas. The Chetas were bands of guerrilla fighters, and you can see a picture of VMRO Chetas. A member of a Cheta is called a Chetnik. You've probably heard this term because the Serbians also have Chetas. We'll see those. And Serbian Chetniks have survived into the wars in the 90s and aughts. So now these VMRO Chetas were running around attacking Ottoman positions throughout Macedonia in order to try and create a Macedonian state. In some cases, the Chetas became incredibly violent, and these violent ones were what were called Gemijite. And the Gemijite operated primarily in Thessaloniki and the areas around that area. A lot of Thessaloniki, at that time called Salonika, or under the Slavs, they called it Solon. But Thessaloniki was the largest city in the Macedonia region, and therefore control of it was incredibly important for all of the groups that wanted to resolve the Macedonian question in their favor. And so you had the Gemijite bombing a number of locations in Thessaloniki in 1903, and the Ottoman authorities began to arrest them and deport them from Ottoman territory. It's important to point out that the VMRO was operated entirely from within Ottoman territory, despite the fact that Bulgaria kept sending advisors and emissaries in order to train them. So its own development occurred somewhat differently from the way that Bulgaria would have had it develop if it had controlled it directly. And so you can see Ivan Tsonchev. Ivan Tsonchev was a general in the Bulgarian army, and he was responsible for convening the Supreme Macedonian Adrianople Committee, and their goal was to Bulgarify the VMRO and the movement within Macedonia to bring Macedonia into Bulgaria. And so we end up having attacks and raids into the Ottoman Empire led by Tsonchev to rouse those territories. And we also have both the VMRO and the SMAC attacking Greek and Serbian and Albanian communities in Macedonia in order to force them out. Villages were burned, school teachers and schools that taught non-Bulgarian or non-Macedonian languages were shot, and you have numerous massacres committed by these groups. On the Greek side, you have the Hellenic Macedonian Committee, and this committee operates in response to a number of the VMRO attacks against Greek Macedonians. So in Thessaloniki, you begin to have this committee, and in 1897, and this is the reason the committee is started. In 1897, that Greek defeat at the hands of the Ottomans led to the end of Filikieteria. It was very clear from the Greek political position that they could not interfere in the affairs of the Ottoman Empire, lest they risk a direct engagement with the Ottomans, again, like 1897, and the great powers wouldn't intervene, and Greece would be subject to violence from the Ottomans and possible extinguishing of their state. So they weren't allowed to directly intervene. That said, a lot of Greeks sympathized quite strongly with the situation of the Greeks in Macedonia. And so Bishop Germanos Karevangelis, this is a different one than the one who led the Greek Revolution. So Bishop Germanos Karevangelis went into the territory, and he came with a number of Greek military advisors like Georgios Katechakis, who you can see in the upper right-hand side. Now, Karevangelis and Katechakis both tried to disseminate pro-Greek propaganda in two very different ways. but both through the Hellenic Macedonian Committee. So the committee actually built their own barracks headquarters in the center of Macedonia, right? That's the city of Thessaloniki. And that building still exists today. In fact, it's a museum to exactly this struggle. And Karavangelis went to Greek communities inside of the Ottoman Empire and tried to foster within them the spirit of fighting on behalf of Greece. Those who were risen to fight were called Makedonomachoi, and the Makedonomachoi, you can see them in the lower right-hand side in sort of modern reenactment. You would think that this would necessarily cause antipathy between Karavangelis and the Ottoman authorities for having raised a number of rebels and individuals like Katakakis, who are now training these guerrilla fighters. But actually, Karavangelis and the Ottomans got along relatively well. He directed his Makedonomachoi to not attack the Turkish positions and other Muslim groups if they could avoid it, and instead go after the VMRO and other organizations. That said, in order to Grecify certain regions of Macedonia, you have reciprocal massacres of Bulgarian townships and Serbian townships throughout the Macedonian region. The Serbians as well send their forces south. And so you have the development of Serbian aligned Chetas. The Serbians had the best propaganda division of any of the three Christian nations that we've discussed. And that propaganda was promoted by the Society of Saint Sava, which provided scholarships for Macedonians to come to Belgrade and to study. And while they would study in Belgrade, they would be taught Serbian propaganda, which would help them identify as Macedonian more than Bulgarian, and therefore be aligned with the Serbian Orthodox Church and Serbify them. For some, it worked, and that led to the creation of the Chetas. For others, like for example, Krstimi Sirkov, the person who developed the Macedonian identity, was one of those who had been offered the scholarship. So it didn't work in all cases, but it worked in many. In the cases where political wrangling and education didn't work, there was also military adventures, and the Serbians were willing to actually commit soldiers to the invasions of North Macedonia and the antagonism of Ottoman forces. So it wasn't just Chetas, you also had direct attacks from Serbia, although the government would often feign ignorance of these attacks. And again, like the other Christians, we see massacres of non-Serb Macedonians. All of this comes to a head in the Ilindin Preobrazhenie uprising. And this is an uprising by the populations of Slavic Christians in the Ottoman Empire. The first one of these is the Krushevo Republic, which is declared in 1903 on the 2nd of August. And the Krushevo Republic is founded by Macedonians or Bulgarians, depending on whether you believe that these are Bulgarians at this point or these are Slavic Macedonians at this point. And the Krushevo Republic survives for about 10 days before it's put down by the forces of Hussein Hilmi Pasha, who's the Inspector General of the Balkan region during this relevant time period. Additionally, you have Stranja, which exists in the area of very close to Alexandropolis. It occurs along the Bulgarian-Turkish border today, near the region of Thrace. And Stranja was a communist-style commune. They were independent for 2 weeks in comparison to the 1.5 weeks of the Krushevo Republic. And they were also put down. Both of them were put down with incredible ferocity by the Turks who disbanded them. And this led to numerous Bulgarians fleeing from the territories of the Ottoman Empire into Bulgaria proper, bringing with them the stories of Muslim oppression. In Bulgaria and Macedonia today, the Khrushchev Republic and its declaration of independence is celebrated. But in Bulgaria, it is seen as a Bulgarian event led by Bulgarians living within North Macedonia. And by Macedonia, it is seen as the first independent Macedonian republic. One of the interesting things, and this sort of crosses into what we discussed last week, is that Hussein Hilmi Pasha, despite being incompetent to the point where these rebellions could start in the first place, was not bothered in 1908 by the Young Turks when they took power in the Young Turk Revolution of 1908. In fact, he kept his title and would become Grand Vizier shortly after this. And the reason for that is that while he was in charge of the Balkan region, he allowed the CUP and other anti-Abdul Hamidian organizations to meet in Thessaloniki. And because he had protected them when they were weak, the CUP was willing to extend the favor back. So as we've discussed, you have a number of different massacres. We talked about in the Preobrazhenie, we talked about the Komitadjis, the Bulgarian Komitadjis attacking Greek and Serbian teachers. One that I didn't mention was Zagoricani. In fact, the name of the town has completely changed. It's a Greek town now. And in Zagoricani, all of the Bulgarians were attacked by Greek mobile paramilitary units. And unlike the Chetas, they weren't, because Greeks aren't Slavs, they use a different name. The term was Andartes. But these Andartes are very similar to Chetas in that they're paramilitary that attack without provocation and massacred the Bulgarian population. The massacre of Zarichani is still remembered and commemorated in Bulgaria today. So there's a question here. Have I visited these places? I haven't visited the small towns, but I visited a number of the larger cities in these regions. In this region, I think the Balkans is absolutely fascinating. And that's why I thought it was a good story. I also think it's a good story to talk about why the Ottoman Empire feared so much in World War I. Because of how much destruction happened here, the Ottoman Empire was worried about that destruction happening closer to Constantinople. Now, similarly to the League of Prizren, in 1899, you have the League of Peja. And the League of Peja, in fact, involved a number of individuals who had been part of the League of Prizren. For example, Haji Zeka, who you can see in this statue here. And Peja is the Albanian name for the city that the Serbians called Peć. Peć is an extremely important city in Serbian Orthodox. You can see the patriarchal monastery of Peć, which is where the Serbian Orthodox Church is headquartered and has been since the 14th century. But Peja was a majority Albanian city, and so the Albanians came together and once again proposed in 1899 to the Ottoman Sultan that they have a degree of independence. And once again, they were defeated militarily and prevented from doing so. One of the things that we begin to see with the Albanian movements, as opposed to the movements of the Christian states, is that the Albanian movement cannot be religiously aligned, because increasingly we see that Christian Albanians are part and parcel of the Albanian struggle against the Ottoman Empire. And they side with other Albanians rather than their co-religionists, be they Catholic or Orthodox. And so what ends up happening is that the nationalist movement that starts to develop, and we're going to see more of that as we move further in time, tends to be oriented around Albanian ethnicity in a purely secular fashion. And when you've seen how much power the religious leadership has in the Christian countries in terms of coordinating and organizing these revolts, the lack of the religious element in the Albanian case really hampers a lot of their ability to organize and coalesce around a common theme. So in 1903, we then see a change in Serbia. Alexander Obrenović, he is a descendant of Miloš Obrenović that we saw earlier, and his wife Draga Mašin are assassinated by an officer corps. That officer corps is led by Dragutin Dmitrijević, who you can see in the center. Dmitrijević becomes a hero to Serbs who were increasingly angered by Alexander Obrenović's conciliatory stance towards the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Remember that to many Serbs, not only was expansion into Macedonia important, but Bosnia was a historic Serbian territory and should be part of Serbia. So any relationship that Alexander I Obrenović was trying to cultivate with the Austrians put him in negative lights. Dmitrijević allowed the Karađorđevićes to come back to power under Petar I. In fact, Petar I would be king of Serbia until World War I. But Petar I always knew that it was the military corps that was in charge. And this resulted in a number of changes within the organization of Serbia itself. In particular, Dmitrijević was able to form a new group of Četas who were called the Black Hand, starting in 1911. And those Black Hand would go into Bosnia with the intent of reuniting Bosnia with Serbia. Mark mentioned Gavrilo Princip, who was the assassin who killed Archduke Franz Ferdinand. That man was part of the Black Hand. One of the things that this also changes is that Serbia is more and more increasingly militant against Austria. And so the provocations between the two countries kept escalating to the point where no solution could reasonably be found after Gavrilo Princip's assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, because the countries simply couldn't trust each other anymore. And this, of course, is when we see the Young Turk Revolution of 1908. And at that same time, as Mark mentioned, we have the Bosnian crisis of 1908, where Austria-Hungary uses that moment where the Ottoman Empire is preoccupied with the Young Turk Revolution, where the Russians are preoccupied with the revolution of 1905 and the fallout of the Russo-Japanese War, to annex Bosnia, the Sanjak of Novi Pazar, and Herzegovina. But it's not just that those territories are taken by the Austrians. And you can see people in Sarajevo reading the annexation proclamation on the wall. The fact that Bosnia had de jure been part of the Ottoman Empire meant that there was still some possibility that that territory could become Serbian in the future. The fact that Austria-Hungary now took direct possession of it meant that that possibility would no longer exist, and that inflamed tensions between the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Serbians, who denounced mightily Austro-Hungary's annexation of these territories. We also see a development in Greece, which is that the recalcitrant monarchy, which had been slow to militarily, economically, and socially develop Greece, was overthrown by a military corps led by Nikolaos Zorbas. And because it was based in the military barracks outside of Athens called Goudi, they were called the Goudi coup. In 1909, this all happened, and this officers' corps decided to create a new king and tried to create a new leadership style in order to the king remained, but he dismissed the prime minister in the face of this coup, and a new prime minister was appointed. But this prime minister was not able to effectively lead to these changes given how many of the old guard remained. So the military then scheduled an election in which liberals prevailed, and those liberals called upon Cretan politician Eleftherios Venizelos. Remember him from the battle in 1897 in Crete. At this time, he was living in France, and he was called from afar to become the new prime minister of Greece. He held his own new elections, and he was able to take 320 out of 356 seats in the parliament for his party, giving him a sweeping majority and allowing him to enact the Greek constitution of 1911. Now, this constitution did a number of things for modernizing Greece, and a lot of these were social reforms. For example, child labor was abolished. Nighttime labor for women was abolished. There began to be labor unions permitted in the country. You started to have a more unified military command with more modern insignias. You started to bring over foreign advisors to help the Greek military further advance. And the Greek Navy, which was already the best in the region, got increasingly better. Eleftherios Venizelos, in fact, ruled Greece as prime minister from 1910 till 1920 with a few interruptions. But because of this, he was able to shape the modern Greek state and create a country that was actually able to progress in a way that it hadn't since 1897. Now, what's worth talking about is that despite Eleftherios Venizelos coming from Crete, Crete was actually not part of Greece when he took power in 1910. In 1908, there was another revolution in Crete, and the International Commission was expelled. Those Cretans who took independence for themselves declared that they would engage in enosis, or union, with Greece. And you can actually see the the Cretan flag here that says enosis thanatos, union or death, which is a very similar to the previous Greek motto, which is still the motto of the Greek state, of the Hellenic state today, eleftheria ή thanatos, freedom or death. In this way, the Cretans were manifesting their desire to become part of Greece. And you can see down with the Turkish flag, up with the Greek flag, that Crete would become part of Greece, at the lighthouse in Chania. However, the great powers didn't want the enosis to take place. And so in 1912, when the Cretans actually sent representatives to Athens as part of Eleftherios Venizelos' government, Venizelos actually locked them out of the parliament building and refused to receive them, effectively saying that the enosis had not properly occurred. Ironically, as soon as the Balkan Wars started, the International Commission recognized the enosis as a fait accompli and allowed the Greek flag to be hoisted over Chania, recognizing Crete as part of Greece. Now, we finally get to Albanian nationalism, and Albanian nationalism comes to the fore really in 1909 and 1910. In 1909, you have Catholic Albanians in the north who are fighting against the Ottoman Empire to preserve their territory against Montenegrin advances in the region. And they feel that the Ottomans are not doing an adequate job supporting them. But by 1910, you already have Albanians from all different walks of life starting to come together against the Ottomans and to try and assert their own independence. To this, Abdulhamid II orders there's a comment here that the Chetniks in the Eastern Mountains during World War II were a fearsome and brutal paramilitary band of mostly Serbians, with their motto being freedom or death. That's absolutely correct. And those Chetniks would be modeled on the Chetniks of this period. And Serbian, and there are also Chetniks that existed during the wars in the 90s and the aughts. So this has been a consistent paramilitary organization in the Serbian world. Absolutely. Now, the Albanians, when they wanted to seek independence, Constantinople sent the Kurdish Hamidiya irregulars that had fought against the Albanians, that had fought against the Armenians in the east, to slaughter the Albanians in the west. And of course, this did not engender goodwill between Albanians and Ottoman Turks. There was really a goal, increasingly it seemed, within Constantinople to Turkify the population and forcibly conscript them against their will into the Ottoman army, overtax them relative to what they had been. And so Albanians were increasingly dissatisfied with that situation. In fact, Hasan Pristina, who was one of the leaders of the Albanian rebellion, came to Constantinople and had a meeting with Ismail Kemali. And we met Ismail Kemali last time. He was an Ottoman parliamentarian during the counter-coup period. And he was an Albanian origin. He had a meeting with Hasan Pristina, and far from getting Pristina to lower his arms and to reintegrate Albania into the Ottoman Empire, Kemali himself became an Albanian nationalist and went to Albania to help assert Albanian independence. Another person that we've seen before, Esad Pasha Toptani, he was one of those who presented to Abdul Hamid II the demand for his resignation. He was part of that Young Turk coalition. Esad Pasha Toptani also came to Albania to help organize Albanian forces in the 1910 and 1912 revolutions. The Ottomans also reacted to try and Turkify the Albanian population by closing down Albanian schools. You can see here, this is the Masonia Toria, and the Masonia Toria is the oldest surviving Albanian language school. For a long period of time, Albanian didn't have a written form, and to write Albanian was a very contentious issue because Catholics wanted to write it in the Latin script, Orthodox wanted to write it in the Cyrillic script, and Muslims wanted to write it in the Arabic script. The eventual decision was made to write it in Latin script, but of course, because of the political associations with that, the Ottomans were afraid that it would distance Albanians from an Ottoman identity and shut down a lot of these schools. Of course, that had the reverse effect of promoting Albanian nationalism because they could see their culture being erased. We also discussed that during the same time as this Albanian nationalist revolt in 1910 and 1912, we also have the Italo-Turkish War, which is where the leading commanders of the Ottoman Empire were placed. You can see that the Ottoman Empire's priorities tended to be to put experienced and committed commanders into confrontations with the European powers and leave the Balkans region mostly managed by irregulars and less capable military leaders. And that led to the Ottoman Empire not being able to effectively suppress any of these rebellions. Now, in 1912, because of how abusive the Young Turks had been, there was the savior officers who came from the Balkans and installed a new set of generals in the Ottoman Empire, and they would be in power for about a few months before the Balkan Wars would start, right? Which meant that the Young Turks would not get any flack. Sorry, not the Young Turks, the CUP, the Committee of Union and Progress, would not get a lot of flack for what would end up happening in the Balkan Wars. So let's talk about the Balkan Wars for a second. We've got this Balkan League sort of assembling, and you can see the Bulgarians, Serbians, Macedonians, and Greeks all standing together, finally deciding that they needed to stand together because the Ottoman Empire was increasingly difficult to deal with. The Bulgarians needed support, given that they had ostracized themselves from Russia. The Serbians wanted protection, and now that they were increasingly belligerent towards the Austro-Hungarians, and the Greeks wanted the ability to expand into Macedonia, and they couldn't do that with the land forces that they had, given that defeat in 1897. So these groups really came together, and they had an understanding, secretly developed, of how they would proceed in terms of liberating the Ottoman territories. The Bulgarians had the strongest military, and so they would be thrust into the region of Thrace, directly targeting Constantinople and weakening the Ottoman ability to fight. The Serbians would extend southward, liberating all the regions towards Macedonia. And the Greeks, who had an effective navy, would prevent Ottoman reinforcements from showing up. A lot of the Ottoman army was on the Asian side. And so despite the fact that the Ottoman Empire had a vast military, most of that military would require the sea in order to be deployed in the European theater. They couldn't, if the Bulgarians effectively cut off the land access from Thrace, the Greeks could cut off the sea access. And so they made these secret agreements. The Serbians and Bulgarians also made a secret agreement of how they would divide up Macedonia. They didn't read the Greeks into this, but they didn't really see that the Greeks would be able to take any Macedonian territory, so for them it wasn't an issue. And I think we're at the witching hour, so I'll leave the actual war, the actual Balkan Wars, for next time, and we'll cover that actually in 2 lessons when we get to World War I in the Middle East, because this will flow right into that. All right. So next week we are going to talk about Persia and sort of taking Persia from about 1850 until around 1925 through the development, through the weakening of the Persian monarchy, and the creation of the Persian constitution. And in 2 weeks, we will spend the next 2 weeks in 2 weeks, the next 2 weeks, as in weeks 2 and 3, will be World War I in the Ottoman Empire, the first part being the various military campaigns, and the second part being the internal policy, including the discussion of the genocide. So given that I appreciate all the thank yous and accolades, that's always welcome. There's a question of where can we see the previous presentations. The previous presentations are at our website, and also this Sunday at 11 a.m. Eastern time, we are going to be doing an update on the Ukraine-Russia war, and we're going to have all of our usual experts. Aaron will be there to discuss the military details. Greg will be there to give some context. He grew up in Russia in the 1970s. And several other individuals who can cast some light will be there. So even though it's not my biggest forte, we will definitely, like all the other members in that Ukrainian history series, we will discuss it, and we will be open to taking your questions. So you will actually have that interactive engagement with our panel to discover more about the Ukraine situation. With that, I think goodbye, everybody.